Okay, biologists, we are now back to lecture number 19, part 2 of ecosystems. So we're going to jump all the way down to slide number 43. What do ecosystems and organisms need to function? Well, this slide is meant as a little bit of a hint. This is the sun, because all ecosystems and all organisms need energy. We need energy. And where does that energy come from? Well, pretty much most biological processes are supported by the sun. There's only a few exceptions to that on the deepest parts of the ocean, but at least for this particular purpose, we're going to be referring specifically to sunlight energy. And really, there's two strategies for getting the energy locked up in sunlight so that you can utilize it for other biological processes. The first strategy is known as being an autotroph. Autotroph. Auto means by yourself. Troph means to eat or to nourish. So an autotroph is an organism that is able to lock up sunlight energy and acquire all of the nutrients that it needs, or at least to acquire all of the biological nutrients it needs to sustain itself. Autotrophs are also known as primary producers because they are essentially at the bottom of the food web. Now, they do produce their own energy. They take that sunlight energy, and through the process of photosynthesis, which you learned about many moons ago, they are able to create organic molecules, actual chemical molecules that have locked up the energy that was inherent in the sunlight. Phytoplankton do this, plants do this, there are even bacteria and other organisms that do this. And autotrophs themselves actually fall into a couple of different categories. Different kinds of autotrophs include photoautotrophs. Photo means light, so these are autotrophs that use sunlight to make their chemical energy. Here are plants as an example of that. But let's not forget chemoautotrophs. Chemo refers to chemicals. So chemoautotrophs are organisms that live on the deepest parts of the open ocean, very close to hydrothermal vents where huge amounts of sulfides and other chemicals are being basically spewed out of the rocks at extremely high temperature and pressure. And there are bacteria that live in these deepest parts of the ocean that are able to use the hydrogen sulfide in a similar way as plants use light energy to lock it up into chemical energy. So chemoautotrophs are living on the bottom of the ocean doing a similar process to photosynthesis, just not with sunlight. But we're going to really focus just on photoautotrophs for this particular lecture. And being an autotroph, that is being able to produce your own food, is different from heterotrophs. Hetero means other, and troph, again, means to nourish or to eat. So heterotrophs are other nourishers, and these are known as consumers. So these are all of the organisms that eat other organisms to get their energy and their nutrients. So a heterotroph could be a grazer, like an herbivore like this, but it could also be a predator. So in both cases, these are organisms that are eating other organisms in order to acquire their energy and their nutrients. So now we have to actually draw a distinction between energy and matter. It's not something that is easy to discern for most people, at least initially. So we're going to now look at how to decouple energy and matter in a system. What you're looking at here is a dead whale. And this dead whale is providing a huge amount of matter for an ecosystem. It has to be broken back down so that the primary producers can then use that raw material. But I also am showing you a sun up here. The sun is representing the energy in a system. And the energy is constantly raining down on our planet. The sun is always up in the sky. It's always pouring huge amounts of energy on top of us. And that's really a good thing, because energy flows through all ecosystems. It doesn't stop, it doesn't get recycled, it flows straight through, and what is not used is given off as heat. That is very different from matter. Matter, which includes nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, these things work in cycles. So they do get recycled to some degree on our planet. So energy flows through systems, matter cycles through systems. And how do they cycle? Well, they cycle through levels in food chains and in food webs. Each of these different levels we refer to as a trophic level. And organisms in an ecosystem can occur at different trophic levels. You have those at the very bottom, including grasses and other primary producers, and you have others that exist at levels higher than that, all the way up to the highest trophic levels, where you have things like polar bears, dinosaurs. Certain dinosaurs would have fallen at the highest levels of the trophic level. Now, trophic levels really refer to that position in a food chain. That's really what we are referring to. And if we take a look specifically at heterotrophs, because we know that autotrophs, those organisms that are photosynthetic, they exist at the bottommost trophic level, but heterotrophs can exist at all different levels above that. And ultimately, heterotrophs are getting their nutrients and energy from eating autotrophs. And these include things like herbivores, right? Herbivores are eating plants, and they're acquiring their nutrient that way. But then you have carnivores that are usually eating the herbivores, and so they're meat eaters, and they are also getting their energy from the herbivores, which got their energy from the plants that are the autotrophs. Let's not forget the omnivores. That includes you and me. Humans are omnivores. That is, we eat both plants and meat. And then these two yahoos down here, I just had to take a picture of them at the LA County Fair a few years back. They were so proud of, I think that's funnel cake. Not quite sure, but boy, there's a lot of calories in that. And then, of course, let's not forget the decomposers, or the detritivores. This seagull over here is perfectly happy eating dead, decaying stuff. And so decomposers are very, very important. Usually bacteria are decomposers, and so are fungi, mushrooms, and that sort of thing. They're very good at decomposing organisms. Okay, so we're going to arrange these now, these autotrophs at the top with the herbivores next, carnivores next, and then these guys all get mixed in there, and eventually the decomposers breaking everything else down. They are going to exist in a food chain. And the food chain works by organisms essentially interacting with each other and feeding on one another. This is what ends up into a food chain. It's a linear sequence of levels, and you generally only have about 4 or 5 links in this food chain. You generally don't have like 7, 8, or 20 for a reason that you will understand in just a few slides. But they usually have a limited number of levels in a food chain. And it can look something like this. You have your primary producers here at trophic level number 1. Trophic level number 2, you have your primary consumers, which are the herbivores. That is, they're the first consumers. These guys are then eaten by the secondary consumers, which include, like this guy here that would be eating the insect. It's a carnivore. And of course, these guys are eaten by higher level consumers, like this hawk. Now, every one of these organisms here is eventually going to die. And when it does, the nutrients that are inherent in these organisms get released by bacteria and fungi, which decompose these organisms, returning their nutrients to the nutrient pool, which can then be used by the primary producers once again. Now, we keep talking in terms of food chains because we're talking about a chain of events going from low-level trophic interactions to high-level trophic interactions. But the reality is food chains are just really a part of a much larger system that we now call a food web. Food webs include a collection of all the food chains in an ecosystem. And so this is actually a better representation of things because while this bird right here might eat a fish, it also is perfectly happy eating this worm or this clam or this little shrimp-like organism here. It'll eat all of them. So this exists in one food chain, another food chain, a third food chain, and a fourth food chain. You put all these chains together, and now you have a food web. And now this food web that you're looking at here is rather simple, right? It's a rather simple one. I mean, you're looking at like a dozen different organisms. But in the real world, food webs can be quite complex. Okay, so don't memorize this. This image actually came from a real life ecological study that was published just a few years ago. But the authors here were not necessarily so concerned with the actual interaction of one organism with another. What they were most concerned with is how much matter and energy is available down here and how much of it gets transferred up the food web until you end up with higher level trophic interactions up here. They were concerned with a budgeting issue. So I don't want you to memorize this. This is just an illustration demonstrating that food webs can be quite complex. Now, energy flows through a system, though. Okay, it never stops. It's never sequestered for very long periods of time. And when that energy that is obtained from, for example, in this beetle, the energy that this beetle obtains from eating this food ends up getting allocated to many things. Some of it gets allocated to growth, some of it gets allocated to respiration, and the rest of it is just given off as waste. But energy ends up getting lost at each step along the way. The organism that comes along and eats this beetle to acquire the energy out of the beetle will also be losing some of that energy. So the question is, how much of the energy actually gets transferred from one trophic level to the next? Well, it depends on what system you're talking about. Some systems are more efficient than others, but it's usually somewhere between 80 and 95% of the energy gets lost at each transfer. And it gets lost in the form of heat. That means that how much of it are you actually gaining? Well, you're only gaining about 5 to 20%. A nice round average would be about 10%. About 10% of the energy on average actually gets gained and transferred to the next trophic level. So I'm going to refer to this in this class as the 10% rule. It also means that more energy gets processed at lower levels on the trophic level. So that means that you're going to get, based on the amount of sunlight energy that gets locked up during photosynthesis, more of that's going to go into your body if you eat plants than if you eat animals. Okay? So there is actually an argument, a really good one, for being a vegetarian, or at least in eating more vegetables, because in so doing you're having a much lower impact on the environment because you're obtaining that energy from a much lower food source. Okay, let's take a look at trophic pyramids now. So what this means is, since you are losing energy with each trophic step, how much of the primary producers do you need in order to support large organisms at the top? Well, one measure of energy is the calorie. Okay, that's a measure of energy. So if you had 100,000 calories of this whale, for example, how much of the trophic level underneath it would you need to support that 100,000 calories? Well, if you use that 10% rule, and you know that only 10% gets accumulated, you actually need 1,000,000 calories of krill, of these little shrimp-like organisms that baleen whales eat. In other words, to support 100,000 calories of whale, you need 1,000,000 calories of krill, and to support 1,000,000 calories of krill, you need 10,000,000 calories of phytoplankton. So you can imagine on an exam, if I was to ask you, let's say you have this much whale, how much phytoplankton would be necessary to support this much whale? You would have to know that there's a trophic level in between there, and that you need to take 10% of this to get that, and 10% of this to get that. Okay? So think about that, review that for the final exam. Over here, again, because of this loss, because of this basically 90% loss, only a 10% gain, it limits how large your trophic pyramid can be, right? You have primary producers down here, lots of them, feeding only 10% energy into the next trophic level, feeding only 10% energy into the level above that. So why not have 8th level predators? Of course, the answer is there isn't enough energy passing through the system. Eventually, you'll get to 0. Okay, this is very different. Energy flows right through the system. That is very different from the way that matter works in systems. Matter cycles. Matter gets recycled. It can move up and down food webs, and it ends up but it also comes with an energy transfer associated with it. it. So energy transfers in ecosystems are always coupled with matter transfers. That's why it's really hard to distinguish between the two of them. But they are not the same thing. They are very much separate. Matter ends up changing form. For example, in this case, this yellowfish is going to be getting energy from these redfish, right, by eating them. But he's also going to be getting the carbon and the nitrogen and the phosphorus that makes up this redfish. Likewise, this yellowfish, all of the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus that is in this yellowfish will eventually get incorporated into this bluefish, who will also acquire energy in this transfer. The difference is that the energy flows straight through, while the matter ends up getting cycled. So let me show you a good illustration of this. Let's decouple these two, okay? Let's start out with sunlight energy, high quality sunlight energy, lots and lots of sunlight. Now, the sunlight's going to be passing through the system, starting with the primary producers, right? Those are your plants and your other photosynthesizers. Then you've got your consumers, everything from your herbivores to your omnivores and your carnivores. And everything dies, and eventually the decomposers break it all back down. So the sunlight energy comes into the primary producers, all that trickles its way down through the system, and each one of these little boxes here gives off low quality energy as heat. So the sunlight energy, high quality, comes in, it gets utilized by the system, and then it gets put out as low quality heat, okay? So this is the flow of energy. It flows right through the system. It doesn't get sequestered, it doesn't stop. The difference between that and matter, which in this case would be like nutrients, all of those decomposers down here are putting the nutrients, the carbon, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus, into this global nutrient pool, which kind of cycles back and forth in and out of the system. The primary producers here, along with needing sunlight, they also need water, nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and of course they need carbon. So all of that stuff is going to be moving through the system too. It's going to be picked up by the primary producers. The consumers are going to get it by eating the primary producers. The decomposers are going to get it by breaking down the dying or dead consumers and returning it back to the inorganic nutrient pool. So again, this model actually demonstrates very clearly how energy flows through the system, but matter cycles through the system. And they are decoupled that way. Well, let's talk a little bit about matter recycling specifically. Matter is able to move up and down trophic levels. Because lions are eating zebras and gazelles, eventually the lions and the zebras and gazelles all die, and the decomposers return their nutrients to the nutrient pool, which then are pulled back up by the primary producers, and the primary producers are eaten by the zebras and the gazelles once again. So the matter is actually able to move their way around the food webs, okay, up and down the trophic levels, and the prey's tissue, that is, the cow, the tissue from that cow ends up getting used to build the tissues for the next trophic level. That's basically how that works, okay? Well, that is true also of chemical cycling. We're going to talk about chemical cycling, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, and carbon, as though they are matter, okay, as though they cycle through the system. Organisms end up moving these chemicals around. We know them as nutrients, right? They move the nutrients around in that ecosystem through a couple of different means. The first one is known as the sedimentary cycle. This is the cycle whereby nutrients end up getting moved through sediments. Autotrophs pick those nutrients up. The heterotrophs end up feeding on them, and eventually the decomposers break them all back down. Okay, that's the sedimentary cycle versus the gaseous cycle. Gaseous cycle is where the similar kind of nutrients, instead of moving through the sediments, are actually moving through the atmosphere. Okay? So you have atmospheric cycling of chemicals, and you have sedimentary cycling of chemicals and nutrients. And the first one that I want to bring up is the water cycle. Water has the greatest influence of any of the nutrients or any of the materials we're going to talk about on life on this planet. There is the environmental water cycle, which is what you may have learned in the 6th grade, where the atmosphere actually causes or water evaporates off of the oceans and off of lakes into the atmosphere, As the atmosphere loses pressure as it goes over a mountaintop, it ends up raining that water back out, and it flows down through rivers and eventually makes its way back to the ocean. That's the environmental water cycle. That's different from the organismic water cycle. In this case, water gets taken up by living plants through their root action, recall back to the plant lecture, and eventually it works its way up to the leaves where it can actually evaporate out of the stomata. When it evaporates out of the top, it ends up drawing more water up through the roots. And this system is called transpiration, or it's also seen as evapotranspiration in some textbooks. Now, this is the water cycle. Again, I'm going to talk you through it. Here's the ocean or lakes and rivers, either way. And evaporation occurs off of the oceans, lakes and rivers. It brings moisture up into the atmosphere in the form of clouds. But when the clouds approach land and begin to rise as they hit the side of a mountain, they lose pressure and all the water inside of them ends up precipitating out. When it precipitates out, it forms rivers, which then flow down into lakes, which then can flow out into the ocean. However, some of the freestanding fresh water on land can percolate down into groundwater aquifers. And this is where a lot of fresh water can be stored over long periods of time before they get utilized and eventually shuttled out into the ocean. It's a great place for fresh water to be retained for a while before continuing the cycle back out to the ocean and then for evaporation to occur again. Okay, let's now move on to the carbon cycle. There are two main sources of carbon that is available to living organisms. The first one is carbon in gaseous form, right, as the form of carbon dioxide. And the second form of carbon is inorganic carbon, carbon that is locked up in rocks or potentially even in plants as plants degrade. But most carbon is tied up in organisms, shells, and rocks. That's really where you find the vast majority of carbon on the planet. And the way that this works is you see carbon cycling from the atmosphere into the water where the carbon dioxide actually gets absorbed. And that carbon dioxide can then be used for photosynthesis by plants and phytoplankton that are in the water or by plants up on land. The carbon works its way up through that organic system as herbivores consume the plants and then the predators consume the herbivores. But ultimately, if you have organic matter, organic carbon matter, that gets deposited in these holes in the ground, over geologic time, you can actually cause that carbon to be sequestered and converted into fossil fuels. Oil, gas, and coal, we're going to talk about those coming up in another lecture, but oil, gas, and coal actually are carbon-rich sources that at one point ultimately came from photosynthesis that occurred tens to hundreds of millions of years ago. And we're going to talk about global climate change, carbon cycling, and all of this in the last lecture of this class. And we're going to talk about how it is creating an imbalance in the natural carbon cycle by taking carbon that should be sequestered in the ground and actually putting it up into the atmosphere in a proportion that is out of sync with the natural carbon cycle. Okay, the next one that we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen also comes in different forms, and one example would be in the form of ammonium, and ammonium is NH4+. That's found naturally throughout the ecosystem, or also in atmospheric nitrogen. Now, the only way that you can use atmospheric nitrogen, because that's a totally inert gas, is by fixing it, by turning it into an organic nitrogen source that organisms can actually use. Nitrates are also found, and they come from ammonium. Once you nitrify the ammonium, you convert it into something that can actually be used by organisms. This is the kind of stuff that you would fertilize your plants with, okay? The nitrogen cycle we're not going to dwell too much on. However, you should be aware that nitrogen is a limiting resource. It's a very important part of the natural chemical cycling, along with phosphorus. The difference is that nitrogen is actually driven by biological processes, whereas phosphorus is driven more by geologic processes. Phosphorus ends up getting released by rocks being weathered over time. And primary producers, plants, for example, end up taking up that phosphorus and working it up into the food chains by turning it into or combining it with other things to make organic molecules. Consumers like you and me end up getting our phosphorus by eating other producers. So that's kind of how it works. And then decomposers end up returning that phosphorus to the ecosystem where it then gets cycled back up again. So we've just now got done talking about all of the components of ecosystems, how organisms interact. We also got done talking about how energy flows through systems. And now we've just finished talking about how nutrients and other inorganic materials end up cycling and entering the nutrient cycle, and how those materials actually cycle through ecosystems. So in so doing, I want to remind you now of the grand scheme of things and where ecosystems fit in all of this. We initially started off in this class talking about organisms a number of weeks ago, and those were individuals, members of a population. 2 lectures ago, we talked about populations. These are interbreeding members of a community of individuals. A community is the interacting group of many species inhabiting the same ecosystem. Okay, you guys are seeing a picture emerging here, aren't you? And if you take a bunch of communities and put them together into an ecosystem is a community of organisms and the non-living environment around them all interacting together to form a coexistence of organisms with their natural environment that looks something like this. Okay, this now ends the ecosystem lecture, and I will see you all in cyberspace.